My mother leaned across the table at my sister's engagement dinner, patted my hand like she was smoothing a wrinkle out of a tablecloth, and said to my sister's future in-laws, "This is Tessa, our unemployed one. Don't mind her. Don't embarrass us by asking what she does." I smiled. I said nothing. 20 minutes later, the groom's father, an editor-in-chief at one of the biggest publishing houses in the country, started describing, in detail, the anonymous writer his entire team had spent 8 months trying to identify. He was describing me. Welcome to Sweet Payback Stories. Tonight's story begins with a sentence meant to smooth over an awkward introduction, and ends with a stranger at a dinner table accidentally identifying the one thing my own family had spent 3 years refusing to ask me about. My name is Tessa Nolan. I'm 34 years old, and for the past 3 years, I've worked as a freelance ghostwriter, the kind of career that exists almost entirely in the negative space of publishing, my name never on a cover, my work read by millions of people who will never once know I wrote it. I want you to hold on to that detail as this story unfolds, because the entire architecture of what happened at that dinner rests on the specific, deliberate invisibility I'd built into my own career, an invisibility my family mistook, for 3 straight years, for failure. I need to take you back further first, because the word unemployed didn't appear out of nowhere that night. It had a history, and the history matters. 3 years ago, I was a senior copywriter at a respected advertising agency downtown, the kind of job with a title people recognized instantly at family dinners, a steady paycheck, an office with my name on a little placard by the door, a corner desk I'd worked 8 years to earn. My father was diagnosed with early-onset Parkinson's the same spring I turned 31, and I remember sitting in the neurologist's waiting room with him and my mother, all 3 of us pretending to read old magazines, none of us actually absorbing a single word on the page. Within months, it became clear that his care was going to require a level of flexibility no traditional office job could accommodate, appointments that shifted with little warning, bad days that arrived without any pattern I could plan around, mornings where he simply couldn't manage getting dressed without help and someone needed to be there who wasn't rushing to catch a train downtown. I made a decision that felt, at the time, both frightening and completely clear. I left the agency, turning in a resignation letter I'd rewritten 4 times the night before, and I started freelance ghostwriting full-time, work I'd already been doing quietly on the side for 2 years, work that let me set my own hours entirely around his neurologist appointments and the unpredictable rhythm of his condition. My manager at the agency told me, kindly, that the door would always be open if I changed my mind. I never did. Some decisions, once you've actually lived inside them for a while, stop feeling like sacrifices, and simply become the shape of your life. I tried to explain this to my mother once, early on, sitting in her kitchen with a cup of tea going cold between us, the same kitchen I'd grown up doing homework in. I told her I was leaving the agency to freelance, that I'd be writing full-time, that it would give me the flexibility I needed for Dad. She set down her own mug slowly, and I remember the specific way her expression shifted, concern folding into something more skeptical. Freelance, she repeated, like the word itself tasted slightly off. So, no benefits. No steady paycheck. Tessa, do you understand what you're giving up? I told her I did, that I'd thought about it carefully, that the flexibility mattered more right now than the title on a business card. She looked at me for a long moment, the specific look she gives when she's already decided something isn't going to work before you've finished the sentence, and said, "Writing isn't a real job to build a life around, Tessa. It's a hobby people do until they figure out what they actually want to do." I started to explain the contracts, the agent, the actual structure of the work, and she waved a hand, already moving on to ask whether I'd thought about what I'd tell people at Thanksgiving. I didn't argue further. I've never been especially good at arguing with my mother, a skill I sometimes envy in other people. I just nodded, finished my tea, and quietly decided I wasn't going to explain my career to her again. That decision, more than any single dramatic moment, is what allowed the word unemployed to take root and grow, unchallenged, for 3 full years. What my family didn't know, because I'd simply stopped offering the information after that conversation, was that ghostwriting, done well and done consistently, is genuinely lucrative work. My contracts, structured through a literary agent I'd found through a former colleague, typically included a flat fee alongside a modest royalty share on the finished book sales, an arrangement common enough in the industry, but rarely discussed outside of it. Over 3 years, working steadily, sometimes on 2 projects at once, I had built an income that was, quietly, comparable to what I'd made at the agency, sometimes better, depending on how a particular book performed once it reached shelves. I paid my own bills. I contributed, more than my siblings ever guessed, to the specialized equipment my father eventually needed at home. None of that ever made it into a single family conversation, because money, in my family, has always doubled as a scoreboard, a way of quietly ranking who was doing well and who wasn't, and I had learned, the hard way, that the safest move was simply never handing anyone a new number to rank me by. My sister Renata's engagement dinner was held at a restaurant with the kind of hushed, expensive lighting that makes everyone look 10 years more successful than they actually are, low candles on white tablecloths, a waiter who refilled water glasses before anyone noticed they'd emptied. Aidan's parents were seated across from mine, my father quiet beside me in the wheelchair he'd started needing more consistently that year, his tremor more pronounced on bad days, though this, thankfully, wasn't one of them. He wore his good navy blazer, the one he saves for occasions, and squeezed my hand once under the table before the appetizers arrived, a small, steady gesture that had become its own kind of language between us over the past 3 years. My mother had been chatty and bright all evening, the specific brightness she reserves for occasions where she wants everyone watching to think well of our family, laughing a half-second too readily at Aidan's father's jokes, complimenting the restaurant's decor twice in the first 10 minutes. I'd been doing what I always do at these dinners, answering in short, pleasant sentences, redirecting attention wherever I comfortably could, watching the room the way you watch whether you already know is coming. It was over the appetizers that Aidan's mother turned to me and asked, kindly enough, what I did for work. Before I could answer, my mother leaned in, patted my hand, and delivered the line I'd heard some version of at nearly every family gathering for 3 years running, polished by now, delivered with practiced ease. "This is Tessa, our unemployed one," she said, laughing lightly, like it was an affectionate little joke rather than a factual erasure of my entire career. "Don't mind her. Don't embarrass us by asking what she does." She said it warmly. That was always the trick of it. The warmth wrapped around the dismissal tightly enough that anyone who flinched at it would end up looking unkind for flinching, rather than her looking unkind for saying it. I smiled, the same practiced smile I'd perfected over 3 years of exactly this moment, and let the conversation move on without correcting her. I want to be honest that this wasn't dignity, not entirely. It was exhaustion. I had corrected her before, gently, at earlier dinners, and watched the correction get absorbed and repeated as a joke about how sensitive I was about my little writing thing, which was somehow worse than the original comment. So I'd stopped correcting her. I'd simply learned to let the sentence pass through the room and land wherever it was going to land. It was maybe 20 minutes later, over the entries, that Aidan's father, Marcus, a warm, animated man who I'd learned earlier was editor-in-chief at one of the largest publishing houses in the country, launched into a story that had nothing to do with any of us directly. He set down his fork, leaned back slightly, and got the specific look people get when they're about to tell a story they genuinely love telling. He was telling the table about the biggest book his house had published that year, a memoir that had spent months on every bestseller list, written, he explained, by a ghostwriter, whose identity his entire team had been trying, unsuccessfully, to uncover for the better part of 8 months. "You'd think in this industry, someone always talks," he said, shaking his head, clearly delighted by the mystery of it rather than frustrated. He described specific choices in the manuscript, a particular structural decision to open the book mid-scene rather than with a chronological beginning, a subtle shift in voice partway through part 2 that he said had genuinely surprised him on a second read. Whoever wrote it understood something about pacing that most writers twice her experience never figure out, he said, admiration clear in every word, gesturing with his wine glass for emphasis. He was describing decisions I had made myself, alone, at my kitchen table, decisions no editor had suggested to me, decisions I remembered agonizing over during long nights, while my father slept down the hall, rewriting that opening scene 4 separate times before it finally felt right. I felt my own face do something I couldn't fully control, a flicker of recognition I hadn't prepared for, hearing my own private, unglamorous work described with genuine, unprompted admiration by a stranger who had absolutely no idea who he was sitting across from. My mother, ever alert to any deviation from the evening's carefully managed tone, caught the flicker, and, misreading it entirely, tried to smooth it over before it could become anything. Tessa likes to write little stories sometimes, don't you, honey, she said, patting my hand again, the same gesture, the same warmth wrapped around the same erasure, except this time it landed in front of the one man at that table who was actively, professionally trying to find the person she'd just reduced to a hobbyist. Marcus, still riding the enthusiasm of his own story, mentioned, almost as an aside, exactly how hard his team had searched. 8 months, he said, trying to track down the ghostwriter for a major follow-up deal, blocked at every single turn by an unusually airtight confidentiality agreement arranged through the writer's literary agent, tighter than anything he'd encountered in 20 years in the industry. Whoever she is, he said, laughing, shaking his head, she's better at hiding than half the witnesses I dealt with back when I did true crime acquisitions. I sat there, holding my water glass, understanding for the first time that the anonymity I'd built around my own work hadn't been an accident of the industry. It had been a deliberate boundary I'd constructed myself, for real, specific, contractual reasons, a professional wall my own family had never once bothered to ask me about, mistaking the silence behind it for absence rather than architecture. That's when my phone, sitting face up beside my water glass out of pure habit, lit up with a notification I hadn't anticipated and couldn't stop in time. My literary agent, Priya, congratulating me, subject line fully visible for one unguarded second, on the same book's just announced award nomination. I reached for the phone too quickly, flipping it face down a half second too late, but not before Marcus, mid-sentence, caught the title in that subject line, the exact title he'd been staring at in internal emails from his own team for the better part of a year. He stopped talking. I watched him actually stop, mid-sentence, his fork suspended slightly above his plate, his eyes fixed on the spot where my phone had just been, the whole table going quiet in that particular way a room goes quiet when everyone senses something has shifted before they understand what. I'm sorry, he said slowly, looking at me properly for what felt like the first time all evening, setting his wine glass down with deliberate care. That title on your phone. Where do you know that from? I felt every eye at that table turn toward me at once, my mother's hand still resting on mine, her grip tightening almost imperceptibly, my father, quiet beside me, watching with the specific attentiveness he still brings to a room even when his body no longer cooperates the way it once did. Aidan looked between his father and me, clearly lost. Renata had gone very still. I had a choice in that exact second, the same choice I'd made 100 smaller versions of at 100 smaller dinners, to deflect, to laugh it off, to say it was probably a coincidence, to protect the evening's careful, comfortable narrative one more time. I didn't take it. I wrote it, I said. Just that. No performance, no dramatic reveal, just 3 quiet words landing into a silence that had gone completely still, the clink of someone else's fork against a plate 2 tables over suddenly, absurdly, the loudest sound in the room. Marcus set his fork down entirely, staring at me now with an expression that had nothing to do with the family dynamics playing out around him, and everything to do with 3 years of professional curiosity finally, unexpectedly resolved. "You're joking," he said, though his voice made clear he already believed me, some part of him already recalculating everything he'd just said about her, about me, in the past 20 minutes. I told him I wasn't, that the structural choice he'd praised earlier, opening mid-scene, had actually been a fight with my editor for the first 2 drafts before she came around to it. His face changed completely, admiration replacing surprise in real time, leaning forward now like he'd forgotten there was an entire table of other people watching this happen. My mother, beside me, had gone very quiet, the specific quiet of someone rapidly recalculating an entire evening's worth of careful management, her hand finally sliding off mine. Renata, across the table, wasn't quiet at all. She let out a short, disbelieving laugh and said, "I knew it. I actually knew it." Every head at the table turned toward her instead of me, Aidan reaching over to touch her arm in confusion. "You knew?" I asked, genuinely startled. She nodded, a little sheepish now, twisting her napkin in her lap. "Months ago. I stopped by your agent's office to drop off that package for you, remember, when your car was in the shop, and there was a shipping label sitting right there on the front desk with your full name on it, next to a manuscript box." She shrugged, apologetic. "I didn't want to make it weird. I figured you'd tell people when you were ready, and it wasn't really my story to tell for you." I sat with that for a moment, the strange, quiet gift of my sister having known and simply waited, respecting a boundary I hadn't even explicitly asked her to respect. It was my father who spoke next, his voice slower than it used to be but perfectly clear, cutting through the noise at the table with the specific authority he'd always carried even as his body had grown less cooperative. He set down the glass he'd been holding steady with both hands and looked at me directly. "Why didn't you just tell us you were doing well, sweetheart?" he asked, and I could hear, underneath the simple question, genuine hurt rather than accusation, a father realizing he'd been left outside something important without ever quite understanding why. I felt my throat tighten before I answered. "It wasn't about you, Dad," I said, reaching for his hand, steadier than usual tonight, thankfully. "It's just, publishing contracts routinely include confidentiality clauses. The anonymity wasn't a secret kept from our family specifically, it's a professional boundary that applies to everyone, agents, editors, even the people at the printing house sometimes." I paused, feeling the rest of it rise up, 3 years of quiet accumulation finally finding a door. And somewhere along the way, after being told writing wasn't a real job to build a life around, I just stopped trying to explain a career to people who'd already decided, years earlier, that it wasn't one. I didn't look at my mother when I said it, but I felt her stillness beside me, the words landing exactly where they needed to. My mother didn't say much for the rest of that dinner. I want to be honest that I didn't feel triumphant watching her go quiet. I felt tired, mostly, the particular tiredness of finally being seen in a way that should have required far less spectacle than it apparently did. Marcus didn't let the moment end at the dinner table, either, which surprised me more than almost anything else that night. He reached out formally 3 days later, a proper email through my agent, not a dinner party pleasantry but a real, considered offer, a new project, credited this time, my actual name on the cover for the first time in my entire career. I read the email standing in my kitchen, the same kitchen where I'd written most of the manuscript he'd been describing at that dinner, and I had to sit down halfway through it, my hands not quite steady. I called Priya, my agent, before responding to anything, needing to talk through what this would actually mean professionally. "You don't have to take it," she reminded me, the way she always does, careful never to push me toward a decision that wasn't fully mine. "But Tessa, if you want this, it's a real one. Not a favor. He's not offering because of the dinner. He's offering because your work earned it, and now he just happens to know whose work it is." I sat with that email for a long while before responding, turning over exactly what it would mean to finally step out of the specific, deliberate invisibility I'd built my career inside of, a boundary that had protected me professionally for years, but had also, without my fully realizing it, become one more way of never quite requiring my own family to reckon with who I actually was. There was a follow-up family dinner about a month later, quieter, just my parents and Renata this time, no in-laws watching, no polished performance required, the kind of small, ordinary Sunday dinner we hadn't really had in years. My mother, midway through the meal, set down her fork and said, carefully, that she hoped I understood the unemployed comments had always been meant affectionately, a bit of teasing, nothing serious. I didn't accept that framing, and I didn't explode over it either. I set my own fork down and said, evenly, it didn't land as affectionate, Mom. Not once, not across 3 years of hearing it. I watched her open her mouth to respond, probably to defend it further, and I kept going before she could. I'd appreciate it, going forward, if you asked me real questions about my work instead of writing the answer for me before I had a chance to give it. She was quiet for a moment, her eyes a little bright, and I braced for another deflection. Instead, for the first time in longer than I can remember, she actually asked, "What are you working on now?" 4 simple words, but I felt something in my chest loosen hearing them asked plainly, without a joke wrapped around them for protection. I told her, about Marcus's offer, about the credited project, about how strange and unfamiliar it felt to imagine my own name on a cover after 3 years of careful invisibility. She listened, really listened, all the way through, asking a genuine follow-up question near the end about how long the project would take, and it wasn't a grand reconciliation, nothing tied up with a bow, just one honest conversation, where a question got asked and an actual answer got to exist in the room instead of a joke standing in its place. I accepted Marcus's offer on my own terms in the end, full public credit negotiated clearly into the contract this time, my name printed on a cover for the first time in my career. A fact that still catches me slightly off guard when I see the advance proof sitting on my desk. I used a portion of the advance, quietly, without announcing it to anyone, to help cover a piece of specialized equipment my father's physical therapist had recommended, a stand assist device that's made his mornings noticeably easier, the kind of decision I'd been making invisibly for 3 years, and for once, didn't feel any particular need to make visible now either. Some kinds of care don't require an audience to be real. I'd learned that a long time before anyone at that dinner table ever did. I think about that engagement dinner sometimes, the warmth in my mother's voice wrapped so carefully around a sentence designed to make me smaller, and the strange, unplanned mercy of a stranger's professional curiosity accidentally undoing 3 years of careful family narrative in the space of a single dinner course. I don't think about it with anger anymore, most days. I think about it as the night invisibility, the very thing I'd built deliberately to protect myself, finally, briefly, worked in my favor instead of against me. If there's a version of yourself that's been quietly doing real, difficult, meaningful work while the people closest to you kept writing a smaller story about who you are, I hope tonight reminds you that you don't need a stranger at a dinner table to finally say it for you. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this one in the comments, and if you believe quiet, patient truth eventually outlasts even the most polished family narrative, stay close, because Sweet Payback Stories has another one waiting for you very soon.